I'm gonna start by sharing my screen so I could pull out a presentation. Okay, there. So the presentation is about Southern women in the Civil War. I would like to give agency to these women because they played important roles in the South. As the Civil War occurred, women were left behind to run plantations, to take charge, and to enter roles that they were not used to. And as the war progressed, they were impacted greatly. Much of the Southern women disagree on the war and urged soldiers to return because what they were experiencing and kind of left alone, abandoned, was too harsh for them to cope alone. And ideally, I would like to have this conversation or presentation in a conference or a museum setting where they're speaking it about Civil War to give agency to these women because often they're left out in history and they're not seen as important figures to discuss when talking about the Civil War. So this is the reason why I decided to do a presentation on them. So the Civil War began in April 12th of 1861. It was the Union versus the Confederacy, the Union being the northern states and the Confederacy being the southern states. The war ended in April 9 of 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy. And the causes of the war were due to the economy and slavery. Uh, it was caused between tensions between the North and the South. South being um, free to hold slaveries, and the North banning slaveholding. Uh, the Southern states often wanted to expand slavery further, and the Northern states did not want to. They, in a way, not really wanted to end slavery, but wanted to stop the spread of slavery to the North. And it was also an economic factor because Southern states heavily depended on slave work for free labor to run and kind of produce these crops that were majority tobacco or cotton in plantations um, at the cost of slavery. And ending slavery or not allowing for slavery to further expand placed a hold on the threat of their economy because the southern states were predominantly um, an agricultural economy versus the northern states. They were much more industrialized. So these were the two main reasons that led to the Civil War, as the North and the South uh, viewed in tension over these two factors. How the Southern women helped the war. First, in the beginning, women were very patriotic and romanticized the Civil War. They viewed the Civil War and saying goodbye to their husbands and their sons as a very heroic act of the men of the South leaving to fight for what they believed in. Elite women especially organized fundraisers for the war to collect funds and provide as much uh, financial support as possible to these soldiers. Other women who were not elite and could not organize such fundraisers sewed uniforms, blankets, and socks for the Confederate soldiers. And women also began to ration their food supplies because during war, uh, supplies will become very limited, and they wanted to provide as much food resources as possible for the men who were going to be sent out to fight the war. As the war progressed, Southern women began facing some difficulties. The absence of white men in the South forced Southern women to fill in positions that were not traditionally suited for a Southern woman. Southern women were not used to harsh labor or working the fields or any such thing. They were used to, be in charge of their household, and that's all. But when the men started to leave to war, women had to, in a way, step up and fill in these positions. And that was something that was very different, and it was a different change. Southern women did not want to deal with such responsibilities either. They were not used to it. Um, we cannot view them as lazy, but rather something out of the norm for them because they were just raised with ideals of them being, Southern belles and staying at home, doing what they considered were lady chores, and suddenly taking charge and taking positions once held by men. It was very different, and they felt uncomfortable, and often they just didn't want to take the responsibility. And you could see that throughout. There's this quote that women were now confronted odd but overwhelming day-to-day responsibilities that they were regarded as not rightfully theirs. We cannot judge them that they were lazy, but they was just responsibilities they were not used to having. And a sudden change was, you know, really felt by these women. Too many sacrifices were being done as well. Much of the shift in women's perception of war arose from the ever expanding dimensions of required sacrifices. No more delicate gloves, no more jewelry, no more ice cream and cakes, no more meat and grain, and the loss of loved ones. So women were, used to these having these things, and suddenly they just didn't have them anymore. It was a very impactful change, and it seems very petty for them, but it was something that they were used to. It was a culture they were used to and they were raised, and suddenly not having it, it's, you know, it's something that you're going to take notice of. And especially the last bullet point, the loss of loved ones, was very tragic. And to much of the Southern women, they were facing a lot of sacrifices. A lot of soldiers were being killed and they were losing loved ones left and right. And it was something heartfelt that they felt a lot of times. And women started to quickly change their perception of war. By 1863, Southern women demanded government support. Southern women demanded support from government officials or else threatened to urge their husbands and sons to return home. Martha Rivas informed her husband after the news reached her of the Southern defeat at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. I want you to come home as soon as you can after you get this letter. Quotes like this were seen throughout uh, as women beg their significant others and their sons to return back home because things were looking rough for them. They were pretty much close to being out of resources to stay afloat and continue to live, and they really needed their husbands and sons to come back home and kind of take charge over the situation and take control of these plantations or businesses and just return to, you know back to reality or to what they were used to just a normal um a normal lifestyle they were used to. And they demanded government officials to do something, but often their demands went unheard of. Women were no longer patriotic or romanticized the Civil War. Women began getting tired of the war and tired of sacrificing not only, sources for their survival, but they were tired of sacrificing loved ones because a lot of these men were being killed. There's this quote I want to share that states, "What do I care for patriotism?" One woman pointedly demanded, "My husband is my country. What is a country to me if he be killed? The Confederacy?" Emily Harris complained in her diary in late in 1864. "I almost hate the world." Quotes like this were seen throughout these letters that Southern women were sending to their loved ones and husbands and um, sons or nephews or dads, um, urging them to come back home. They were no longer patriotic. They no longer agree with the war. They wanted the war to end and they just wanted their loved ones to just come back because it was just a horrific lifestyle that they were now facing. There was no, adequate food sources for them because everything was being sent out to war because everything had to be rationed. And, these women were taking again roles that were meant for men that they could no longer bear to do. And they were just constantly writing to them to come back. And oftentimes, government officials and military generals will ban these letters to be written, and they um, persuade these women to stop writing those letters because that distracted the soldiers. They wanted women to cheer on the soldiers and be very patriotic and not demand their husbands and their sons to return home, because then the Confederacy will lose, because they will lose manpower. And oftentimes, it's sad to inform that these letters that women were sending were never sent out to soldiers, or they were never given to the soldiers to not distract them. And this is an example of such letters that could be found in several archives written by Southern women, portraying, their views of war and just their desperation just to have their loved ones return home and just, go back to their normal lifestyle that they once had before the war began. Food inflation. Southern women demanded government officials to lower food prices and prevent inflation rates from increasing, but their pleas were unheard. Inflation rates affected food prices, and Southern women did not have enough money to purchase food. Even though their husbands sent a monthly allowance of $11, it was not enough. And this is a chart comparing the food inflation from 1860 to 1863. If we take a look at bacon from 1860 was $1.25, and 1863 it was now $10. It was a $9.75 cent increase that was very impactful. Again, soldiers were sending monthly allowance of $11, but if bacon is $10, you're only left for $1 to survive for the next month. And these were examples of why women were urging men to come back, because it was not enough for them to make ends meet. They were starving, and they had to find resources how to live and also how to feed, their children. This leads to riots. And one important riot was the Richmond Bread Riot. It took place in the Confederate capital, Richmond, on April 2nd of 1863, and was one of the largest, most disruptive in the series of civil disturbance conducted by Southern women. As government officials ignored Southern women, they took matters into their own hands. Crowds of women banded together to seize bread and other provisions they believed their dues. Looters seized bacon, ham, flour, and shoes, just basic necessities for them to eat and not starve. And this is an illustration of what the riot might have looked at. And I would like to take time to kind of discuss that not a lot of people agreed on these riots, right? And these were government officials who had plenty of money to continue to feed themselves, and other elite women who were perhaps much more wealthier also had enough money to feed themselves, and they never, you know, saw the necessity to riot over food. And they often criticized these women and called them um looters, and that they were classless because they were rioting and being disruptive. But again, they were doing so to get food on the table for their children. They were doing it out of necessity, not just to riot and looter, but it was out of necessity and out of protest that government officials were ignoring their pleas. These women were starving, they were sick and tired, loved ones were dying left and right, mothers, their sons were killed, their husbands, and they were just tired, and they wanted the war to just end because they were being affected and impacted by the war directly. And that's something that, it's not often mentioned or discussed about. And this is the reason why I decided to do this presentation of the women in the South during the Civil War, because they too fought the war in a way as they, in the beginning, try to be patriotic, try to provide the soldiers with all the resources. And as the war progressed, slowly but surely, these resources began to disappear, and women were left to starve. Oftentimes, uh, Union soldiers will cross over and will rape these women, or Southern women were so desperate to have food and to provide, food and shelter for their children, that they will sell their bodies to Union soldiers over a loaf of bread or over some change, because they were just simply desperate to survive. And that is it.